Good morning all, and welcome to our AROP webinar on COVID, economics and cities. Thank you for joining today. I'm Filippo Gaddo. I'm the head of economics at AROP, and I will be the host for the day, and I will moderate the sessions and the panel later on. Just to give you a little bit of introduction and give you the run of the day, and also some housekeeping rules. There will be two sessions today, one now at 10 o'clock in the morning, and then we'll have a session at 4 p.m. as well. And both sessions will be recorded, and the material from both sessions will be shared with all attendees. So whether you attend this morning session, you cannot attend the one at 4 o'clock, or the other way around, you will be access to all the material and the information that we'll be providing today. Today we have a kind of packed session, very interesting session, and a good set of speakers and panelists. And I will go through kind of relatively quickly now. So we'll have Jerome Frost, which is our global head of planning and our board member, and he will give a context of the day and an introduction and a welcome from AROP, followed by Joseph Hargreaves, who will kind of present our scenario report, which we launched originally in June, but is updated today. Then we'll have three kind of speakers from AROP who will present some of the work they've been done around kind of the pandemic, COVID-19, and how do we recover from the current crisis. And then we'll have a panel for the last kind of 35, 40 minutes, where we'll be joined by Vicky Price and Spencer Dale as well with Jerome, and that will be our panel. Without further ado, because we have a very kind of packed day, I will pass it on to Jerome Frost, which will give us a little bit of context and introduction to the day. Thank you.
Thank you, Filippo, and welcome everyone. I'm really excited about this because today is a really interesting day to be considering the impact of COVID, and more particularly the way in which we all can start to dream about recovering from COVID. With the vaccine announcement yesterday, I think there is a palpable sense of hope that has come back into everyone's minds. So it's a good moment, I think, for us to be having this conversation. This work really originated actually back in February, when Group Board met and took some advice actually from some medical experts that we regularly speak with, who had really started to look forward to the possible implications at that point of a global pandemic, which hadn't been declared, and led to us having a really quite engaged discussion about the impacts that the spread of a disease like COVID and a pandemic might have on a company like AROP and on our clients. AROP acted, I think, very quickly. We stopped our staff from flying way back in February, in advance of most of the global, the national lockdowns. And since then, I feel as if we've been ahead of the curve, both in our transition to digital working and our foresight, if you like, of the potential business impacts. And that's largely down to the work that Filippo and our foresight team in AROP have done for us in giving us a view ahead through the scenario planning that you're going to hear about today. So that scenario planning, as far as the AROP board was concerned, really needed to consider the impact on our people and the different ways in which we might have to work, and indeed the kind of the new ways of working that we might get used to as a consequence of being out of the office for so long. It considered, importantly, the impact on our business areas. And what was the impact likely to be on use of energy, investment profiles for rail, in particular for aviation, where we've seen some dramatic changes, and all of the business areas that AROP is focused on. And then we extended the work to really think about cities. I think in recognition that whilst national governments were trying to really grapple with a national response to the pandemic, actually in the minds of the people, they were looking to local leadership, and we increasingly see this in the recovery efforts that are being made. And so we really felt we needed to understand what the impact was on cities and what it might continue to look like on cities, and most importantly, as of today, what recovery might look like if it's to be more locally led. And then I think, having done that work and really thought about how AROP can reposition itself and understand and pivot, if you like, to the new the new structure of our industry, we recognized actually that our clients were going through much the same process in really trying to understand what was going on around them and the impact on their business. So I think very quickly the work segued into work that we did in collaboration with clients and work that we could share with a wide range of clients. And I hope that we're joined today by many of our friends and clients around the globe. So I hope that sets the scene. There's a lot more to say, and we've got some fantastic bursts and some guests joining the panel a little bit later on. But I thought it was important just to set the scene, give you a bit of background as to how we came to do this work. And I think we now see it as a new model for the way in which Arup needs to think about its future and the future of our clients together. Hopefully it will drive new partnerships in the way we think. Thanks very much, Filippo.
Thank you, Jerome. That was very helpful, and he set kind of an important kind of context for our day today and also the work we've been doing. And he also kind of signpost a little bit what we're going to see for the rest of today and some of the work we've been doing on the cities. And later on, kind of we'll kind of publish on our website our report, but also some kind of some work we are currently doing around our city resilience kind of index related to the recovery of the pandemic. Now, probably we are now joined by Joseph Hargraves, our global head of Foresight, who will present our work related scenarios, and the report has been launched today. Joseph, over to you.
Thank you very much, Filippo. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you. It's an absolute pleasure to see you at this event. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the report that we have been working on and republished today. I won't go into detail because I've only got a few minutes, but I'm going to outline some of our thinking and then invite you to really download the report and make sense of it in terms of your specific context yourself. So my name is Joseph Hargrave. I'm the Global Foresight Leader at Arup, and I'll be talking to you about the scenario work we've been doing on COVID-19. And this was developed in collaboration with Filippo and his team from our Business and Investor Advisory Group. The scenarios were first developed, as Jerome has mentioned, in Q1 of this year, really with the aim of supporting our group board and our regional boards in our response to COVID-19. And we since published an open version for our clients and partners to look at also in June. And this latest version now we effectively updated, and it was completed on the 30th of October. So all data in the report is essentially accurate up to that date. And like I said, it is available on our website and will also be shared with you after this event through the follow-up email. So you will have an opportunity to look at the details of the report then. Overall, the paper and scenarios seek to explore the ongoing and potential epidemiological impact of the pandemic, and of course the public policy response to that impact. So the scenarios essentially focus on the interactions between the epidemiological situation and the economic impact and response. And you can see here on the image now our scenario axes, which range from economic and policy implications from recession and to depression, and spread of the virus from virus contained and managed to continued spread and resurgence of that virus. So the paper does assume a global perspective with some detail on certain geographies, regions and sectors available in the report, but it does require individuals and groups to, if you like, translate these global context into specific regional variations and impacts as well. So here are 4 scenarios at a high level, and these cover the timeline of the next 18 to 24 months. The situation has, of course, changed and evolved continuously since our Q1 investigation, although you could argue that the core principles of each scenario really still hold true. So we have the bounce back scenario, which was previously called differently, which is the best case scenario. Then we have the global depression scenario, which is the policy failure scenario, the partial recovery scenario, which is a successful adaptation, and the economic collapse scenario, which is, if you like, the worst case scenario. So here's, if you like, a more detailed overview and comparison across the 4 scenarios with wide variations and everything from cases to overall deaths. Like I said, scenario 1 was previously the short pause scenario. The best case is now a bounce back because we have already entered recession in many of our markets. So this kind of idea of a short pause and a rapid recovery has essentially been replaced. In general, the health and economic impacts will continue to be far-reaching across all scenarios, varying really depending on the epidemiological development developments and policy response. In our scenarios, we've got cases to Q4. The best case is 75 million cases, which is already quite optimistic, but we did want to have an extreme scenario where perhaps developments and new treatments or vaccine come to play sooner than expected. And the worst case is really up to 1 billion cases and up to 20 million deaths. And those ranges, if you like, are informed by research from Imperial and our own assumptions based on the data that was available to us. And then other things that are in there, the availability of vaccines. Now, we did have some good news about vaccines, but vaccine development in general remains highly uncertain despite these recent good news, because the speed of delivery, the logistics, the efficacy, and the uptake also of the vaccines are all examples of these critical uncertainties that have, in addition to being in general uncertain, also high regional variation. So we have to be a bit mindful that the scenario, the good news on the vaccines have to be taken with a pinch of salt, perhaps. Here's a quick overview of the high-level business impacts, and there's much more information on this featured in the report and also what it means for various aspects of business. But essentially, our analysis of plausible impacts on different sectors shows that the shape of the recovery and the impacts across these different sectors will really be affected by a whole range of factors. Now, policies around further lockdowns, of course, will play a role, the full or partial reopening of economies, timing on one or more vaccines, the speed of the delivery of these vaccines to the public, and of course, any policies in the immediate aftermath of the pandemic. So lots of uncertainties and lots of factors that play a role. And in this context, there remains significant uncertainty around how different geographies and sectors will emerge from a post-COVID world. And it's important to start tracking those impacts a bit more carefully, also at the local and regional level. A few high-level conclusions in addition to what I've said. We think that scenario 3, the partial recovery, continues to be the most likely and plausible scenario, although you could argue that the likelihood of scenario 2 has also been increasing, perhaps dampened a little bit now by the recent good news on the vaccine. The focus on scenario 3 highlights the need to track and understand the economic and epidemiological situation much more at the local and regional level, and we are working on a range of trackers for both cities and regions to better understand that data at a local level and be able to respond to that with our business and with our clients, and more on that will be shared again after the event. I think both aviation and property will be two key sectors that will continue to be affected. For the aviation industry, I think a more significant recovery, probably more feasible in 2022. For property, it really depends on what type of assets you have and how quickly you can adapt them. And the final thought is really, look, the recovery in China is looking very good, but it's, in my view, unlikely to be replicated in many other parts of the world, although some certain economies, such as Germany and others who are key trading partners in Australia, might yield specific benefits from that recovery. So that remains to be seen how that impacts essentially downstream. What next? What can you do with this? Well, you can do a wind tunneling exercise to really look at how well your business, your project, your organizational context will fare in each of these 4 scenarios. There's a lot more information, data and insights in the report, so do please feel free to look at this on our website or download it via the email, which will be shared after the event. For any further questions about the scenario work, please do just reach out to one of us. Thank you very much. Back to Filippo.
Thank you, Joseph. That was fascinating. And as you said, there is a lot of material that we published and available to download and look at and digest as well. And a lot of conversation and question that we're more than welcome to bring up and discuss with all of you after today. Now, this was presenting kind of a general global macro pictures. We're now kind of taking a little bit down to more kind of practical example and more a micro kind of example around some of the projects example that we've done over the last few months across Europe, and calling kind of adapting to a new normal, or trying to adapt to the new normal, and kind of what kind of clients and the stakeholders and the people that we work with, how they are reacting to the pandemic. We will have 3 presentations in rapid succession, and they will be presented by Karen Shi, our senior engineer from our offices in station Hong Kong, Joan Carmichael, advisory planning and design leader from here in the UK, and Leanne Doody, integrated cities and planning leader from Europe. They will present for a few minutes each, and they will present all the 3 kind of presentation in rapid succession, and I'll pick it up again for the debate and the audience Q&A. Over to you, Karen. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you and good morning. Wishing everyone a good health. I hope it could be seen, right? The live slide. Okay, I'm Karen from the Hong Kong Sustainability team and going to share you something of our local experience. In this pandemic, experts recommend us to stay home, keep a good distance, or stay in a well-ventilated space, but all need space. But Hong Kong is very small and dense like this, and people are eager to get back to their normal life before a vaccine is ready with their own reasons. This compact living and non-stop culture challenges all our developers and operators. They need to put people back, keep them safe in a premises, and avoid being named in on some newspapers. So the mask may not be sufficient, so they come to us. We design space surfaces and we could do our best to minimize the virus transmittance based on medical studies and the latest technologies. So we discussed with the client, airborne part is our focus, especially for dining spaces. Study finds that more than 1/3 of air pollutants are actually bioaerosols, which means that it's a bucket of pathogens, bacteria, virus, fungi, including COVID. So we work with them. In addition to doing masks, we help our clients to include an immune system to the building in supporting the new normal lifestyle with 3 stages: defense, suppress, and recovered. Such as this pilot application we have in the mid of this year, the defense line is set at first in the main lobby with a monitoring and notification system developed by us at the main entrance for everyone to be aware of and rebuild people's trust to getting in. And then we incorporate UVC air purifier to kill virus. And all the frequently contactable surface, we will recommend them to incorporate antibacterial coating, including all the handrail and lift buttons. And the office tenant space, we help them to incorporate another air purifier in combined with a flushing system in the ceiling to incorporate filters and UVC air ion technologies, which keep the space clean. Similar to an human immune system, we cannot go too far, or a protection system will be very cooling. An air purifier might generate harmful gases causing cancer, and continuous operation with a very high flush rate will actually stack up the energy bill for our building. So our value is to give the entire immune system a brain for our client. And the neural health, which we applied here, is an Arab self-developed AI IoT analytic cloud-based platform. The system of the building with this platform could allow data-driven actions more than just monitoring, such as system control, projection, operation, prediction, correlation, and insight for future updates. So with this, we could keep people safe, maintaining properties rental rate for our client, and minimize energy costs spent for their operators. So this is roughly the end of the project sharing in Hong Kong, and thank you very much again, and good health.
Sorry, Joanne, I think you're on mute.
Apologies, there's always one, eh? Good evening from Australia, in Sydney. In Sydney, we've been very lucky. In Australia, indeed, we've been very lucky. And COVID cases have been very low for a very long time, and in some cases are zero in many of our states. And that means that Australian cities have been turning their heads to recovery, albeit in the new normal of COVID world, pending the vaccine, of course. And in this thinking, it's clear that for a while we're going to be living and working and playing differently. At the beginning of the year, there was a lot of intense uncertainty surrounding everyone globally. And we did some thinking around what that meant for us in our cities and in our suburbs. We produced a number of thought pieces. Superbia was one of them, where we looked at our suburbs and we hypothesized what might happen in our suburbs as we come out into recovery. And of course, this thinking is now well established that our suburbs need to do more for us. We've been working with Victorian government to look at 400 of Melbourne's suburbs to determine just how those suburbs can benefit from economic recovery. We've developed activity centre safety, open air trade, buy local campaigns and meanwhile uses, and also systemic change around governance and funding. Our recommendations are now the Victorian Minister for Planning, and we hope to radically change the fortunes of many of the suburbs in Melbourne. And then on the flip side of that, we're looking at the city. And when we think about our cities, really the opportunity for our cities going forward is not necessarily certain. What is the future of the CBD? When will our tourists come back? What needs to change? What should stay the same post-COVID? And what will draw people into the city again? We're working with the Committee for Sydney and many different partners and stakeholders with significant levels of collaboration unseen before in this environment to try and solve what our cities would be going into the future. And then to how we play. This is a fundamental human requirement to have access to open space and to nature. And I think that's something that's well understood now at a global scale, something that perhaps wasn't really understood before. We've written a charter with the Department of Planning, Industry and Environment here in New South Wales, and it focuses on creating quality spaces, looking at environmental, economic, social and cultural values of public space. And there's a number of trends and drivers that lead to quality public spaces, and we've developed 10 principles for spaces in Sydney. Interestingly, what that's led to is an open spaces competition. And the industry submitted over 500 entries for this recent competition. I'm pleased to say that my team won the Minister's Award for their submission, which was to take a disused water pipe and to turn it into a biodiverse linear park and cycleway. I'll hand over to Lane.
Thank you, Jo. If you could, let me just share my screen. And I will, apologies. I'll just share my screen and I'll begin. So can you see that? I hope you can. So I'm here today. My name is Lane Doody and I lead cities and planning work in Europe. I'm here to talk to you today about a report which we've just completed, which I think is quite complementary to the scenarios report and actually also the work that Jo just presented. We have completed this work with a client, iPut, who are the leading commercial property organisation in Ireland. And the focus is really on placemaking. In the light of COVID, and I think we've seen the impact of COVID and the working from home movement on the CBD. This work is really about how offices and commercial property can contribute to the CBD and contribute to their neighbourhoods, and how do we make how do we make strong places in a world where more people are going to work from home. This slide really talks about the historical context, really, in that we have been here before in terms of working from living at work. Digitalization has now enabled us to be able to work from home. But, you know, going through that, we have we have lived next to work. Modernization and commuting allowed us to live away from work, and now we're in a situation where we're really working at home and all the challenges and opportunities that brings. And so as part of our work, we did a survey which of 2,000 people, which to really find out what do people value about the office and what is it that they value about how they're working now. And we discovered a number of things. I mean, first of all, work is a social experience. This is the number one reason people come to the office, and I'm sure many of you are really feeling the lack of sociability if you've been working at home for a long time, as many of us have. It's also about learning, though, and really learning from other people within the office, but also, senior and junior staff, but also partners and collaborators. It's also about culture. It's about belonging and identity, and understanding, getting a sense of corporate culture, building trust with each other. And that the concern is that in this long period of working from home, that's being depleted. It's about collaboration. It's about working with other people. Again, the concern that it's fantastic that we've been able to do this and work remotely, but the concern is that this is being depleted long term, and innovation may suffer. And it's also about reflection and thinking, and we mustn't forget that the spaces that we work in need to support the ability to actually think and reflect as well. So in terms of our response to that, we're really looking at how does this translate into places, and in particular, how does this translate into places of around the office, and what can commercial office owners, landlords, occupants do to give back to the city, but also encourage people to come back to the office. And we've come up with these various typologies, which are very tangible expressions of what can be done. So, for example, watering holes is really about sociability and creating spaces for sociability. Mind labs is really about collaboration and creating spaces where people can come together and work around the office, in the neighbourhood of the office, and at the edge of the office. I'll stop there. The report itself is out today, as complementary to the report Joseph mentioned, and it includes a lot of sort of very tangible takeaways and guidance. So please do take a look. It will be on the ARUP website, and please feel free to get in touch with any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Lynn. That was fantastic. So we had some kind of great presentations from Joseph and our Arab colleagues. Take a little bit of a tour around the macro view earlier on for the scenarios, the context set by Jerome, and also some of the projects and the more micro view, and how actually that translates into everyday life, particularly when it comes to life in the office, in cities, and in the workplace, and how actually our behaviors might have changed. So now we kind of coming through to the panel and the Q&A sessions, and in the meantime, while I get the speakers ready, I will probably encourage you to start asking any question that you may have on the Q&A that you can have. We'll pick up those questions and answer them as we go through. In the meantime, I'll introduce our speakers. We have Jerome Frost, which you saw earlier on and presenting. We have been joined by Spencer Dale, which is the chief economist at BP, and previous chief economist and member of the Monetary Policy Committee in the Bank of England. We're very privileged to have Spencer here today. I think we joined very shortly by Vicky Price, a former head of the Government Economic Service. I think with a little bit of a technical issues that you might expect some time to joining in, but she will join us as well and join the panel debate. And I'll say I'm very pleased that Vicky will join us very shortly, because when I joined as an economist in government, she was working there in the DTI as the chief economist. So probably followed up in my entire career. So in terms of today, and I will probably open up a little bit to give the floor to Spencer to give a couple of remarks. But primarily, what I probably want to cover is the pandemic has been thrown upon us in the middle of some big shifts anyway that were happening, and those shifts have not gone away. And the one in particular that we have been dealing with, and we have been doing a lot of work and in collaboration with a lot of our clients and stakeholders, is the net zero challenge, and what does it mean actually for society and for infrastructure. So in combination with the pandemic, how has the pandemic changed the way we look at net zero and the way actually we're looking at the future of infrastructure? So probably ask Spencer to do some remarks on that, and also Jerome to join in as well, if you wish, so before we move on to the open Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Filippo, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone, and thank you very much for the opportunity to participate. I've been sitting here writing huge amounts of notes because I'm on a huge learning experience here, and you guys have been thinking far deeper about some of these issues than we have, and but very important issues. So thank you for the chance to eavesdrop like this. So the question about sort of how will COVID impact the energy transition, I think is a huge question, and I think the truthful answer is we don't know yet, and there are very significant forces pushing in both directions. At one level, the impact of COVID means governments around the world quite reasonably are focusing on their domestic economies and focusing on the near term like they've never done before, because there's a urgency to get their domestic economies up and running, to focus on domestic resilience. And if you're focusing on domestic near-term issues, your more ability to focus on long-term global issues, which is what an energy transition is about, it is lessened. So there's a big force pushing one direction. On the other hand, I think COVID has, to many people, highlighted the fragilities of our planet and the fragility and the way, the unsustainable way many people around the world are living in our planet at the moment. Moreover, the unprecedented scale of government interventions that we are seeing at the moment gives us a sort of one-off, once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to kickstart the economic recovery around the world in a way which encourages greener, more sustainable growth and sort of turbocharges the energy transition. Which way this is going to go, I think is hard to see, but I guess I'm encouraged just by the momentum that we are seeing at the moment, that the Build Back Better movement may well push through. It's striking that the recent announcements by China, together with Japan and Korea, mean that if Joe Biden elected follows through on his pledges in terms of climate, around 2/3 of the world's carbon emissions will be covered by net zero pledges by 2050 or soon after in case of China. Perhaps even more striking is a number of countries around the world that have committed to net zero pledges has increased threefold in the last year. So there's strong evidence that the momentum behind COVID leading to an acceleration of the energy transition may work out, may succeed, but we should be clear there are strong forces pushing in both directions, and so we need to fight to ensure that we get this the COVID leading to a quicker energy transition.
Filippo, shall I add a few words there? So thank you, Spencer. It's really good to hear your thoughts, and welcome. Thank you for joining us today. I think you're absolutely right. I think the real challenge at the moment is this kind of pressure for short-term response versus the inherent longer-term view that needs to be taken if we're really to achieve the net zero ambitions. And I think one of the ways of thinking about that, and it was interesting actually, I read a Guardian newspaper survey, the UK Guardian newspaper survey of a couple of days ago, got it in front of me here, that started to point out that where we see government-led recovery plans and the detail of those being announced, there's a real stark difference at the moment across the globe in the way in which governments are incorporating the net zero challenge into those recovery vehicles. So I think as we all sit here, and Arup is committed to this, we see this as probably as you say, once in a lifetime opportunity actually to use those recovery strategies to drive the change towards net zero. But the evidence actually from those announcements is that we're not really seeing that come through. Even the European Union and its Next Generation Recovery Fund, according to this latest survey at least, is only dedicating about 30% of the 750 billion to kind of net zero outcomes, if you like, through the projects that it's seeking to fund. And when you start to look at the US, China and other major powers, the number is vastly lower than that. Actually, the European Union is almost leading the way, I think, in this thinking. So I think we have a real challenge if we're going to realise that opportunity. And I think there's two possible responses to that. The first, I think, is to recognise the pressure that governments are under. The economic impact of what we've just experienced has just been massive. And the need to create jobs fast and put money into economies fast really has to be understood. So I think when we start to conceive of infrastructure projects, thinking about social value perhaps as one of the leading agendas for those projects, and being able to describe those outcomes in very real terms, as well as the speed at which they can be delivered, is going to be one aspect of the way in which I think we could make the case, if you like, to advance those. And obviously then, as a kind of outcome, net zero can almost be a consequential built into the design of those things. And then the second thing I think is public sentiment. I think we have seen a real shift during the lockdown period, where issues like the net zero objectives actually have come a bit more to the fore, actually, through community discussion, the means of digital engagement and exchange of knowledge and information and views. I think we're going to see governments increasingly coming under pressure from the public, if you like, to drive towards these outcomes, perhaps more than they've done in the past. So to me, I think there's probably two parallel kind of narratives and cases that need to be made there in order to convince government expenditure. Now, the last thing I would say is that even with that, I think the reality is, given the debt levels that most countries are now carrying, the private sector and private investment is likely to be the real driver of change here. And I think what we're seeing in the banking industry is very, very positive in terms of their drive towards green finance and sustainable outcomes for projects. I think that's baked into banking systems now and investment profiles going forward. So increasingly, I think we'll start to see the private sector playing perhaps almost more of a driving role in moving towards net zero than governments might even do in the short term.
Thank you, Jerome and Spencer. I think both of you packed quite a lot of in there in your response, and I'll probably kind of group into three kind of categories. One of them is the public response from the population and consumers, and the government's response, and actually how do they deal with that, particularly with the issue around the fiscal challenge in the future. And then the role of the private sector. There is one of the questions, actually, a couple of the questions in the Q&A, they're actually focused on the first of those kind of challenges, the level of engagement with the population and the public, and whether somebody asked whether lockdown life has changed the perspective and the behaviors of people. And are they asking for more or less climate and carbon push towards a carbon neutral future? So does the push come from the public, or the public needs to be pulled? What have you seen so far in terms of the public reaction to COVID, and whether it's positive for net zero or not?
I think it's hard. It's hard to know in terms of the general public, and the general public. Many people are facing exactly the same issues that I described initially. You wish to care about long-term global issues, but if you've lost your job, if you're struggling to meet your mortgage payments, then suddenly I'm afraid that may feel, even albeit short-sighted, it may feel like somewhat of a luxury. And I think we need to understand that. I think the bit where I have been most surprised and I think most heartened over the last couple of years, I think both before COVID and after, is the pace at which the private sector more generally has led this process, where the combination of companies in terms of like BP, like Arab, others committing to net zero outlooks, but also in the investment community using that as a disciplining device to encourage and ensure, so in some sense, only be willing to invest in companies which have a clear, sustainable pathway, is leading governments around the world. And as economists, we often say, well, we need a carbon price. When will governments put a carbon price on? But I think the price at which many companies around the world are willingly paying voluntarily is actually often ahead of and leading the carbon price, which is formally set by governments. And I think that is an encouraging encouragement development, and it relates to the point that both you and Jerome made, that in a world where governments both are going to be fiscally very challenged and very focused on the near term, there will be a need for the private sector to play this role. And ultimately, the private sector will only play this role if their consumers and their customers are demanding this. So in some sense, you can think of the private sector as a surrogate or a proxy for that underlying support by the general public. But Jerome, and you're maybe far closer to sort of a sense about where public within different parts of the world are thinking about these issues.
Well, yeah, thanks, Spencer. I think it was interesting actually seeing some of the survey results coming out of the American election as to what mattered to the voting public in America. Economy, it's the economy, stupid, kind of springs to mind, given that it stood out beyond anything else. Given all of the issues, etc., that are being faced in America, economy still came to the fore in terms of what people thought they were voting for when they made their choice. And I think you're absolutely right, and that's the real effect of not even losing your job, but just the worry that now sits in most people's minds about the longevity of their jobs, if you like, in the current context. Really brings that to the fore. So that's the sort of public starting point. Now the answer to that, absolutely, I think the private sector has to play that, and is playing actually much more of a driving role. But I think we'll also see some quite big kind of structural change in the way the public sector and the private sector work to address that response. I think, for example, what we are also seeing is a much greater level of trust in local leadership over and above national leadership. So when the public look to gain assurance and confidence in their future, they look to their local mayors perhaps more than they look to their presidents or prime ministers at the moment. And in that instance, I think it opens up a different opportunity, I think, for new public-private relationships to be formed at a local level. So I think we should start to see, and will start to see, much more of a kind of localism agenda being pushed, where mayors can invite the private sector perhaps to invest in the city, as rather than necessarily singling out the single piece of infrastructure that they might be focused on typically in the past. So by investing in a particular city, the investor is not just guaranteed the results of the project outcome, but they're guaranteed that the local government will be looking after all the kind of externalities that affect the success of that project. And the classic case would be something like a metro, where the typical ridership would be, ridership return would be the equation that most investors would be looking for over a period of years before they put their money in. Actually, that ridership can be affected massively by things totally outside the control of the metro authority. COVID, who saw that coming? And what's the mayor's response to try and regain ridership in the recovery world? So to me, this kind of merging of these two agendas and really understanding that at a local level, longer term relationships can be formed that could be more reactive, quicker to implement, and also kind of clearer in terms of defining whose role is what. The mayor's role is to look after the externalities, the private sector's role is to drive the project delivery. And in that sense, I think that clarity will actually speed up investment and outcomes.
Thank you. Yes,
Felipe, if I may, just from an energy perspective, and just to sort of reinforce the point that Jerome made, we see this in terms of how the global energy system is likely to evolve over the next 20 or 30 years. If you look back at modern energy, the modern energy system has tended to always be dominated by one or two sources of energy. For the first half of the last century, coal was pretty much the only source of energy. Coal declined, and then you saw this increasing dominance of oil. You look ahead 20 or 30 years, as we move to a lower carbon energy system, you're likely to see a far more diverse range of fuel. Coal and oil and gas maintaining a role, but combined with wind, solar, biofuels, nuclear energy. So so increasingly that diverse energy mix driven by customer choice rather than by fuel availability. So you're moving to a world where you've got energy systems driven by customer choice. And that then leads to Jerome's point that many of those markets may become more localized because you're seeing increasing role of electricity and hydrogen, and those energy carriers are harder and more costly to transport long distances. And we see a major role for sort of energy companies like BP helping different regional, local areas, be it companies or a city level, integrate across those different sources of energy to allow them to have their own sort of bespoke fuel mix. And so when we were reorganizing our company to sort of fit this changing energy system, we developed a whole new part of BP, which is called Regions, Cities and Solutions, recognizing that we're moving to a customer-led world rather than a sort of upstream producer-led world, and cities forming relationships with cities, forming relationships with large companies, and thinking of them driving their own decarbonisation agenda is very key to our sort of strategy going forward.
That's great, Spencer, and thank you for that, because it kind of answers some of the questions that came through on Q&A as well, in terms of whether the recovery is city-led or is it national-led, and both of you kind of expressed a little bit some thoughts on how you can do a more kind of cities or local-led. The interesting for me is definitely kind of that shift toward kind of more localized energy, and in your case, kind of Spencer, the fact that you set up a new kind of division that actually look at region and city. The question, though, is exactly on that, regions, cities. To one of the points that a lot of people are making, and if I look at the picture at the moment of London, central London, somebody posted a picture of Regent Street yesterday, completely deserted. The question is, how will cities change? Are we moving to a world where, yes, it's more local, but what's the future actually for cities, particularly inner cities, and how does that affect actually our future of the economies? It might be more localized, but it might be more regional or suburban, or is it actually, what's the future role of actually of cities themselves? How are they changing, and how will they be recovering, and what does it mean in the case of kind of from global planning, but also from the energy perspective? I don't know, Jerome, when you want to pick that up first.
How long have we got, Filippo? now you're on the.
I unleashed you now.
You're onto the town planner's dream subject here. So I hope we've got another couple of hours of this session to go. Thanks for that. I mean, it is frightening when you look at those images of just how empty some of our what we've traditionally come to know as the centre of our cities have become. And I think what was interesting from those bursts is the different exploration of aspects that will start to tempt people back into the cities and how important they are. I think it is very, very important to recognise that there's a huge amount of apart from anything else, a huge amount of carbon invested in the centres of our cities already, embodied carbon in the buildings and the infrastructure. There's a huge amount of money that's been sunk in. And I think it's critical that we start to kind of restart the engine of growth that the kind of that sort of agglomeration of activity has been able to produce for us, not least because it addresses some of the other issues quite fast, particularly this issue of job creation and immediate money into the economy. But I don't think that means that we will necessarily return to the kind of city model that we've had in the past. And I think, as you said at the beginning, we've seen a lot of trends which have been in train for quite some time, long before the pandemic, which move us away perhaps from that single-centered approach that so many, particularly Western cities, have been designed around, that all based on a kind of agglomeration theory which piles everything into the center, but has also led to gentrification, pushing people out through the cost of living, etc., and also congestion. One of the big issues I think facing cities at the moment is congestion. So the response to that, and we're seeing this in China and other parts of Southeast Asia at the moment, is more of a polycentric way of thinking, that we don't necessarily move to a suburban way of life, but we do need to move perhaps to a more, a network series of centres that can operate together collaboratively and create economies between them, and not necessarily just rely on the one kind of central hub. We see that a little bit in places like London, where we've seen some of the new centres like Stratford start to emerge. But if you go to China, many of the new cities, recently I've been involved in the design of a place called Zhong'an, which is about 70 kilometers south of Beijing, entirely designed around this idea of polycentric cities, well-connected, polycentric centres, well connected by fast and rapid transit. And by doing that, you also create then the quiet zones in between where people can live and have that kind of community engagement away from traffic and congestion. So I think we'll start to see that networked economy start to emerge, which again, I think in a Western sense might draw others into the network. So if we talk about London, I see a role for Oxford, Cambridge, the satellite cities as we see them at the moment, actually being drawn much more tightly into a wider conurbation of economy as that connectivity is enhanced. And I think the COVID experience has probably accelerated our move towards that way of thinking.
So, Filippo, can I just ask a question? Jerome said, fascinating. So, if Filippo looks at a picture of Regent Street in 10 years' time, what will it look like?
Well, it's interesting. I think we've seen a little bit of that. It's a slightly different image. But when Joe Carmichael was presenting the work that they've been doing in Sydney, I think the recognition there is actually, I think if you put Lane and Joe's presentations together, I think we need to see this balance of temptation. One is about what does the workplace offer that's different to what you can have at home. So that's all about collaboration and exchange of ideas and sociability, if you like, within the building. But I think perhaps almost more importantly than that is what does the external environment around the building offer that is so different enough to excite you and drag you away, if you like, from your computer screen, in your spare room, like I have. And to me, those two things I think will start to come together. So a sort of inside out view, offices opening more out onto their external environments, that engagement in the streets. Joe talked about kind of pop-up and meanwhile uses. As we reduce perhaps traffic use of streets, we can start to think of streets actually as exciting environments which offer event space, offer amenity space, etc. And I think unless we start to think like that, people will start to question, well, do I really want to go into the office to sit at a desk all day, alongside 100 other people sitting at a desk, not talking to each other, when I could do that at home on my screen? So that excitement of the urban environment, I think, is what we'll start to see come to the fore. And actually, Regent Street has reinvented itself many times over the last 200 years to do just that, actually. The latest being a complete transformation inside the buildings along Regent Street. But that, what preceded that was an excitement on the street itself, with the idea that the street itself and the displays at the retail premises could excite people and attract people.
Thank you. I think, Jerome, and that was interesting because some of the questions that we had in the Q&A were related to
Okay, I assume Vicky has joined. So.
Thank you very much. That's fantastic. So I'll pick up Vicky in a second. I think the comment I want to make was about somebody asked a question about mental and physical health as well. And I think your point about the future of workplace and how it relates to actually working at home is going to be very important. How do you design the city will have an impact on that balance between economic and health consideration. How do you maintain a job and you continue to have a productive society would actually have a positive health solution beyond actually the current situation, because you need to think about the health implication of the current changes as well beyond actually the pandemic. Vicky, thank you for joining us. Apologies, actually, we take a little bit longer to get to you, and we'll probably kind of I'll give you probably 1 or 2 minutes just to take a breather and get into the day. If that's okay, I'll probably ask you to give us a little bit your thoughts on kind of the recovery of the pandemic, in particular with your kind of experience from the public sector and actually being at the heart within the government economic service of the setting of policies. When it comes to the government challenging the future that they have, particularly around the fiscal challenge and the issue on debt, and how do we actually address this? Can you share some thoughts around how government will react in the next 2 or 3 years?
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Hello, can you hear me all right?
Yes, we can. We can hear you.
Oh, brilliant. Yes. You were asking me, I'm sorry about my technical problems. You were asking me about COVID, the recession, and how it might all, sort itself out in the end. If that is what you were talking about.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, we had those results, and I've seen, I was watching everything that was presented, including the various scenarios and the bounce back scenario and so on. But obviously, we've had the news of the vaccine, which was also mentioned, and what the implications of that would be. I think what the world had sort of entered into was this serious concern about what the second wave of the virus was going to be, and what the implications of that would be on the economy generally, with quite a lot of pessimism there. So we expect in the UK, certainly, for the time being, that there will be a decline in GDP in November and in December. But when you look across, and the same in Europe, but when you look across the world, I mean, the interesting thing for me is that despite the huge increase in coronavirus cases in the US and elsewhere, we've seen quite an uptick in world growth taking place in the last few months, and you've seen global PMI going up, mainly China, of course, but also Asia more generally. China having come out of all this earlier. The US, despite the concerns, having some amazing figures over the last month, including on the unemployment front. And what I'm suspecting is that quite a lot of the depression in terms of investment, which has been very badly affected by COVID, might start lifting, because if people start thinking that perhaps the end is near us, if you like, and it's going to be a solution, all those investment programs that have been put into abeyance will start, resurfacing in terms of planning. It might take a little bit of time, but we may not see anything like the drop that we expect we're going to be seeing next year. If you add to that, of course, all this fiscal stimulus that is coming, that has been coming, and what Europe intends to do with its recovery and growth plan, for example, and also what maybe a stimulus package might do in the US if it eventually comes, and the increased emphasis on green. We've been talking about energy quite a lot, and cities and so on just now in the event. I'm beginning to think that perhaps actually people will start revising the forecast quite substantially for next year, whereas we didn't think that we were going to get back to where we were before 2022. It might happen earlier, and that will also have huge implications, I think, for infrastructure spending, or at least infrastructure spending plans for the coming year and a bit.
Thank you, Vicky. That kind of is a very positive picture, and I think you're right in a sense. The obviously news of the vaccine yesterday and some of the data that came over the 2 weeks actually paints a slightly brighter light. And in a sense, your point, Vicky, is that if the confidence increases and the PMI kind of index that you mentioned earlier, confidence increases, demand comes back. And then obviously if demand comes back, then you need to make sure that the supply is ready. So the issue was that the collapse in demand, and then you block the supply by actually turning it off, and then you need to restart it. But it might be that this is an opportunity potentially to change some of that supply chains as well. I mean, Vicky, if I can kind of pick out you in the last couple of minutes again, I think, Jerome, we had a conversation in the past about the issue around governments and the fiscal challenges. What is almost the hangover of the crisis that, okay, the economy will come back, but government will be left with a lot of debt? How do you think actually government will react, and what changes will they need to implement to ensure they address that kind of debt issue?
Well, if you're asking me, I mean, the first thing to bear in mind is that, of course, everyone's been able to borrow very cheaply, and it's not just the UK and Germany and everyone else, but also all across the world practically, with some very notable exceptions. Interest rates have been low, and therefore the cost of actually servicing that debt isn't particularly high. I mean, remember, even after the financial crisis in the UK, by the beginning of this crisis, the COVID crisis, we were borrowing 3 times as much as we had at the beginning of the financial crisis, and yet our interest payments servicing the debt were only just as high as they had been then. So there is a completely changed view of what is sustainable. If you listen to any of the IMF people now, they're saying just carry on borrowing, don't stop this stimulus packages that you've got in place right now, do more if necessary, and think about the implications later. A lot of intentions to forgive debt of developing countries. So there's a lot of that going on to rethink, restructure, and so on. And there already have been debt payment holidays, which have been given both by the IMF World Bank, but also by the Paris Club that has been lending, to those countries. So a lot of private sector type lending too. So there has been quite a change of what is basically sustainable in the longer term. So that's good news. But if markets start finding that there are other things they can now go and invest in, I mean, their view of whether they could still consider bond purchases safe will change. But also, of course, a lot of the bond purchases have been supported by central banks pushing huge amounts of liquidity in the market through quantitative easing, funding practically all that spending. Now, how long can they carry on doing that, and how long will the markets be happy to keep still buying that type of debt rather than doing something else? It's a question mark. So yes, some sort of consolidation will have to take place, but I think starting from a higher base and accepting that we can have higher debt to GDP ratio than we had before. And frankly, if the economies start to recover, and they will be recovering next year anyway, then the debt to GDP ratio starts not looking that bad, even though you have to carry on borrowing probably. But in the meantime, those very low rates will mean that infrastructure borrowing, if you like, and investing in long term is actually quite cheap. It makes huge amount of sense to do the things that you wanted to do, perhaps as sort of by using money that can be available now, or issuing long-term debt of some sort that can allow for all that to happen. So I'm actually quite hopeful that we've turned the corner in terms of really thinking that we have to be constantly tightening up to one where you can live with higher debt, and that everything that happened during the financial crisis was probably a mistake, and the world perhaps has seen sense.
Thank you. Spencer, you want to come in?
Yeah, I just so I agree entirely with Vicky in terms of the advice that the IMF and others given now, that we need to just spend to ensure the recovery, and that a one-off increase in the level of debt as a response of COVID, I think financial markets will look through, and low level of interest rates will help financial markets look through that. So debt seems to me less of an issue. What I am worried about is coming out of this crisis, levels of deficits around the world could be substantially higher. Our tax base will be eroded in many parts of the world. I think the IMF don't think we're going to get back to the pre-COVID trend levels of growth, I think, for decades, and levels of spending will be higher. And I think financial markets will look through one-off increases in the level of debt. If many countries around the world are coming out with deficits, close to double-digit levels of deficits, I think that many financial markets will be less comfortable in looking through those, because that's telling you your fiscal position is not sustainable and you need to do something about it. So I worry that this fiscal overhang will have an important bearing on the environment we're all going to be operating in many parts of the world for the next decade or so.
Thank you, Spencer. And I hate to break it up, because we are getting to a very good, interesting conversation, and the balance between the positive and the less positive. But I think overall the picture is that the economic is, we see turn around the corner from a health point of view, potentially with the vaccine. The economy is actually more resilient than we probably thought a few months back. And the new measures that the policymakers, particularly central bank and government, so far are put in place, have managed potentially to they're kind of managing the situation, particularly from that point of view, relatively well. But then there is still going to be fiscal challenges going forward that will need to be addressed. And we talked earlier on about kind of some of the changes in cities and urban environment. So I think we covered quite a lot of ground on the macro and the micro as well. And we had some kind of great presentation. We are a couple of minutes kind of over, so I'll probably pass it on to close to Jerome to give last one final minute remark, and then send us off to the rest of our day.
Thanks, Filippo. How frustrating. I feel like we're just kind of just getting going, actually. I was really enjoying Vicky and Spencer's debate there. So luckily enough, we have an opportunity to carry that on later in the day, which is fantastic. So I'm hoping we can sort of almost pick up where we left off. But I'd like to say thank you for now to Spencer, to Vicky, and to you, Filippo, and to all of our burst presenters earlier on, because it was a great scene setter, actually, to get us into our discussion. I'm really looking forward to carrying it on. So for now, thanks very much and goodbye.
Thank you.